Hello, my friends, and welcome to Fireside Chats with Longwood University faculty. My name is Brent Roberts, and I am Dean of Greenwood Library here at Longwood University, located in beautiful, rustic, and centrally located Farmville, Virginia. Whoop, 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 whoop. Our guest today on Fireside Chats is Dr. Mike Mucedola, who is author of the forthcoming book, Culture-Based Differentiated Instruction, a guide to teaching health education, which, if you can see, I don't know if you can see this, but it is a fresh copy. You can thump it like a melon. It says, if you can see the fine print, preliminary edition. It is that fresh, my friends. By way of introduction, Dr. Mucedola is a professor and chair of the Health, Athletic Training, Recreation, and Kinesiology Department here at Longwood University. He holds a bachelor's degree in physical education, a master's in health education, a PhD in public health, and master's certification as a health education specialist. His research interests include culture-based differentiated instruction, which we'll talk about a lot today, at-risk youth, chronic disease prevention, curriculum planning, and instructional strategies to increase student performance, attendance, retention, and graduation rates. When he isn't teaching, he enjoys the outdoors, reading biographies and presidential history, numismatics, and studying centenarian population. Dr. Mucedola, welcome to Fireside Chats.
I thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I guess the first question should probably be numismatics. What is the most interesting or rare or valuable coin in your collection?
Well, I love numismatics, which of course is the study of currency and coinage. And particularly, I like dimes all the way back to 1796. But I also enjoy that they're tied to history. So because I'm infatuated with presidential history, a dime from the Civil War era, for example, in the 1860s, that could have been in a soldier's pocket. It could have been in Abraham Lincoln's pocket. For 2 cents an acre, you could have bought a little piece of land in Alaska. So, maybe William Seward for a couple of dimes, scooped himself up a number of acres there. So that's what fascinates me about coinage. But I also like the fact that it speaks to you. There's the artwork of it, the engravers, but there's also, there's value associated with that. So, I buy and sell and trade and collect numerous coinage. So it fluctuates as far as the value is concerned.
Wow, that is fascinating. Well, we'll have to see. If we have a good conversation today, we might invite you back for another session and talk about your coin collection, because that sounds very interesting.
It's fun stuff.
Well, let's get to it. Let's talk about your book. The title underscores the theme, focusing on culture-based differentiated instruction. So let's break that down. What, in this context, what is culture, and how does a person's culture influence their learning process?
So, well, culture is what a person identifies with, and that more is about ethnicity, but it's about customs, about things that they like, things that they identify with, as far as it could be music, it could be foods, it could be lifestyle, religion. There's all these different factors that make up a person's culture, and it's more about that and less about things like race and these other things. Those could be part of somebody's culture, but that might not be the driving force that makes up a cultural group. So it's more about how somebody personalizes or identifies with, and then that impacts, of course, their learning. I mean, if you can find out what that is, and then you relate that into the curriculum, a student is much more likely to be active and interested in what you're doing if they identify with something going on in that lesson that they see in their everyday life. And there's all sorts of ways to go about allowing them to have some say in the learning process here.
Interesting. So how do you allow students to have a say in their own learning process?
Well, you got to assess first. So, you take a thorough assessment to determine, the cultural groups that are represented in your classroom. And then through the differentiation, that's multiple pathways. It's not about individualized learning. It's about providing pathways for them to be able to have choice on how to display mastery of the objectives for that day. So everybody still completes the same objectives, but you give different options on how to go about doing that. And those options are based off of cultural profiles. So, they might learn a certain way. Some want to work by themselves. Some want to work in groups. Some want to have music on, some do not. And then there's different ways for them to disseminate or display. Some want to put together, a PSA to show the urgency with an infectious disease, where others might want to create a poster on that, and others just might want to present on that, or some just might want to journal on that. But there's different ways depending on how you write those objectives and the criteria involved, and then you can go about assessing that. So everybody still gets assessed the same way, completes the same objectives, but they have different say and choice in how to do that based on assessment of a cultural profile.
Well, that's one of the things that I found very interesting in your book, was about this idea of differentiated instruction. And what you've kind of described right now, I mean, how does that not turn into chaos in the classroom if you're trying to differentiate for each individual learner and type of learning?
Well, that's, from a person who has to observe and assess others, and I've done that at, the K through 12 level and the university level. First of all, chaos is a perception. Some might view that as a negative thing. Others might view that as a positive thing. But, you can't have it both ways. I mean, do you want your classroom engaged, or do you want a bunch of docile sheep that are all complying to the latest rules, who are just sitting there quietly? So, in the past, someone might have looked at that classroom and say, boy, that's a great classroom. Look at that. Look how nice it complied. Everybody's quiet, listening. But is learning happening? Is anybody learning anything, or did you come up with some great classroom management strategies in order to get people to comply? Versus another room that looks like chaos, but maybe it's not chaos because learning is occurring. And as long as you can justify and show that through assessments, most administrators would be happy if your graduation rates are increasing and success is happening and more people are getting into college and they're prepared for that, or they're being prepared for secondary jobs and stuff when they leave high school. So I think that the end products there, if you can increase these areas that we really do care about and everybody cares about, how we get there, I think ultimately is more important than what the things look like before that process.
So out of curiosity, so if I peeked into a classroom where differentiated instruction was taking place, can you paint a picture of what would that look like? And so what would the instruction look like from the teacher's perspective to all these different learning styles? And then as the students are working on all these different projects to move toward the same objective, what does that look like?
Well, first of all, you have to hook them into the learning process. So when students start, the very first minute or two is the most crucial part to get them engaged into learning. So that can happen through, a riddle, just a picture, or sometimes you put something just on the front that says, can you figure this out? See, they sit down and all of a sudden, they're on their phone, but they're sort of looking up and they're like, and this is before classes started. See, they're already starting to be engaged in the learning process. You've given them a strong anticipatory set where they are interested already. They're inquisitive, they're wondering, they're curious. And how you structure that, is immediate in the first minute or two. So you got to hook them first of all. And then from there, you really want to keep, instruction. Again, this isn't an absolute. This can happen all sorts of different ways. But, on average, if you can keep it less than 20% of your allotted time, which is usually, 10, 12 minutes, depending on how long class is, of some new material. This is some information that you're going to need. Here are some things we're going to be learning about. This is new stuff. You're filling in gaps. You're presenting new things. And then the vast majority of the class period is they're practicing skills. So when you're looking at this, again, they might be by themselves or in partners or in a small group, and it's how you set this up. And, you've got different options available for them. You have different options available for them, and they're now all working, and then you are simply facilitating. So you're bouncing around, checking in, informal assessing and giving feedback. And you're cueing them at that point, saying, okay, you're on the right track. Where are you at this? But again, part of the assessment is to identify the spectrum of learners in your classroom. You're going to have low skilled learners and gifted learners, and differentiated instruction brings everybody up to a higher level. It challenges the gifted learners so they're not bored. And it also supports the low skilled learners so they are understanding what's going on instead of being confused or not understanding, because if either of those things happen with gifted or low skilled, you're going to have behavioral problems for different reasons. So Again, it's about providing resources, examples, templates, things for low skill learners to say, okay, here's how you get yourself going on the right track, and I will cue you to check in with you. And then the gifted learner, here's how we're going to challenge you today. Again, everybody's doing the same objectives. We're not giving out more work or less work. We're not pairing up the gifted learner with the low skill learner as a teaching assistant. We're not doing any of these things that impede the learning process for a group. We're creating pathways to meet the needs of both of those groups.
I like the idea of that hook at the beginning. As an instructor myself, I try to do things like that. Maybe for your next book, would you consider doing a whole collection of the different riddles or those hooks that to capture student attention at the beginning of class?
Yeah, well, I have a section in the book on anticipatory sets that gives all sorts of strategies on how to go about hooking the audience. And then I give hundreds, 400, 500, 600 different strategies on how to practice skills in a classroom for a different group of learners. And then, of course, hundreds of assessments. And that's what it looks like. You have a hook, you've got a brief introduction of some sort of new material, vast majority practicing. Then we're going to do some closure that's involved in here where we're going to test that affective objective. In other words, what was your confidence level before this lesson? And now what's your confidence level after this lesson, now that you've done this? If we're learning about decision-making skills and substance abuse and these types of things, how do you feel about this? And you might, somebody might do a case study, somebody might do a role play on this, somebody might, do a different type of assignment. But the point is, you learned information to then be able to practice the skills, to then be able to have more confidence to go out and implement those on your own and sustain and healthy behaviors and change unhealthy behaviors.
So throughout your book, you talk about community outreach. There's just it's an element that appears over and over again. It has its own chapter. If we're talking about classrooms and learning styles and strategies, what does community outreach have to do with what happens inside the classroom?
Well, I've been working on this for about 15 years. When I was in public schools, I taught AtRisk students, and I had, when I first started teaching AtRisk students, I was tutoring out of school suspension students. So I'd have a classroom with a third grader doing math, a middle schooler doing science, and a 12th grader doing history. So, and then I'd have 20 students like this in a classroom. So I'm bouncing around doing, the whole spectrum of K through 12 in front of me with students that were all asked to leave the classroom in the regular setting. So, those were some challenging moments, but that's where I got the idea for all of this stuff. And then afterwards, I was teaching regular health education at a high school and working just with at-risk youth. And I had a few hundred students, and that's where these pathways, we had block scheduling. So we had longer class periods, 1.5 to 3 hour class periods. So, the clock will stop in that class period if you don't thoroughly plan. But part of the issue, these things are all correlated with the home environment. And if you've got the home environment partnering with you to help out the student in the learning process, you've got a secret to success there. But the opposite can happen too. If there's no mentoring going on, there's no supervision, there's just, for whatever reason, there's issues happening in the home environment. And I had the full spectrum. I had many students that were in the prison system, many students dealing with mental health, substance abuse, the full gamut of health issues. So, I did a life coach program where I could see inside the house what that looked like. So now, especially with, if English is not the first language being spoken, there's all these different potential barriers to pop up. Community outreach allows the student to be the disseminator of information. So we equip that student in the classroom, and now they go out and you cue them. And this is part of the learning process. So when they go home, and it's something small, where they are now disseminating what they learned and bringing back some information in the process. But now you see what we've done is they're the teacher. And that's an empowering thing for a young person to now be the holder of that information and skill set, and to be able to work with a brother or sister or a parent or a community member or a neighbor, whoever is around. And then you cue them with, questions, and surveying and some other stuff, and they bring that back. You watch what happens all of a sudden where somebody starts asking, hey, what did you learn today? Or, what are we going over today? And they go back in, and now they come back to the classroom and they act completely different because now they need this stuff. This is part of their livelihood, and it's intrinsically motivating for them, and it's sustainable because now learning's occurring outside the classroom. And I would think that most educators want learning to happen outside the classroom walls. So I use the classroom as a way to set this environment up for a forum for them to go out and do these types of things. But when you're talking about different cultural groups and you're talking about very diverse neighborhoods, this is a way to empower people to break those cycles so they don't end up going down a pathway that was not conducive to a positive thing for their quality of life.
Well, so from an educator's perspective, for a teacher who might be interested in employing this approach in their classrooms, how does classroom or behavior management change when you're employing this culture-based differentiated instruction model?
Well, you first got to self-reflect on the strategies you're using. Oftentimes, the educator is causing a lot of these problems through some of the strategies. I mean, they have a meaningful way of going about it, but if you don't understand your student on a cultural level, then you might not understand that what you're asking or what you're doing is eliciting this negative response to occur. So it's about, really understanding the student on a deep level. And then, you got to work within the barriers. I mean, I personally had a rule. I just would not throw a student out of class. It didn't make any sense to me. I just never understood how, if a student's not in class, that's my only chance to change this situation. If they're not with me, how am I going to fix this problem? But if the student's not in class, well, the student loses. I lose, especially if I'm trying to race to the top and no child left behind. All these things can't happen if the student's not in class doing what they need to be doing. And of course, the administration, they lose too. The school loses, the community loses, society loses. Everybody loses with that strategy. So I thought surely something can better happen than everybody losing. And part of that is saying, hey, what's going on here? So in my book, I talk about the pre things to do, the during things to survive the storm, to get through it, and then what you have to do on the post to follow up so this situation doesn't occur in the future. But there's ways to redirect, to minimize, to diffuse the situation, so then you can do that. But part of differentiated instruction allows me to be able to do that. See, my students are all practicing skills. So I'm not stuck like a plant in the front of the room. We're going out. How can I address this student without holding the whole class up? You see, I can now do that because my class is practicing skills. They don't need me to do what they need to do for that lesson. So while they're doing that, now I can go address this student or that student who's off task, redirect that student, and then afterwards, work with that student to get back on a pathway to success here. But I can navigate that whole environment because the environment's been set up to be conducive to learning through these different pathways. So the work's done on the front end. I can facilitate, and now, that's what I'm doing. I'm like, you want to be a shark that doesn't stop swimming, and you want to be, anticipating things that are going to happen and then heading it off before it gets out of control.
Well, I like your commitment to not throwing students out of the classroom. If only I had had you as one of my teachers when I was in high school. That would have been very nice. That would have been very helpful. Well, we're kind of starting to wind down here, but could I ask, how did you get interested in this line of research to begin with?
Well, again, I was working with AtRisk students, and when you go into a home environment and you see some of the hardships, where for many times there was no father figure in the house. Mom was trying to, and this was on average, I would say 90% of them look like this, where again, I was in upstate New York. So what was happening was the family member, it was usually the father, was getting in trouble in the penal system. And we had maximum security prisons in Elmira and Auburn. And so then the family would come up from New York City, implant into the community. And now I have the kids in class, and they were there so they could visit, the parent in the prison system. And mom was just trying to keep the house together. We usually working 2 or 3 jobs. So now, many times there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 siblings at home. The oldest one, in their low 20s, all the way down to one that's maybe 2 years old, and they're all kind of watching each other. Food was a problem. Heating bills was a problem in upstate New York in the winters. That's a severe problem. There's resources, but when you see things like, there's health issues that you read about in books, gingivitis and stuff, but you don't actually see these things until you're working with at-risk students. Then you see these things, and you're like, well, there's a reason why they're coming to class and telling me, to put it where the sun don't shine. If you were in there living in their situation where you're not sleeping, you're not eating, you're freezing, you have no security, parents aren't around, how would you feel the next day coming in trying to learn? I mean, that'd be the least, so understanding that gives you a different perspective and gives you a different level of patience. And then you go about setting up, how can I help the student? And then that's where this situation comes into play. because there's different safeguards in place. There's ways to get them caught up. Every single lesson in this methodology, a student should be able to come that day and be able to complete that lesson. One of the biggest flaws in education is you hear about comprehensive education, these things where you build on units, you build on lessons. You did this on day one, then we've got to build on it day two. Well, if somebody misses in any of those lessons, they're cooked. And once you're cooked and you fall behind, then you don't know what you're doing. You're either going to act out, you're going to drop out, you're not going to be able to participate because you don't have these types of things. But I wrote about a floating scope and sequence, which allows for each unit to be taught individually. And then you cue them. If you were here last class, here's how it connects. If you weren't here last class, here's how it connects to the next lesson that I want you to come to. And here's how these things all, so you can still make it in a comprehensive fashion, but you don't automatically require this prerequisite stuff to happen, or else from an attendance standpoint, this is what's driving students to drop out of school, because the system is set up in a way that they get too far behind and then they give up. But part of the reason why that evolved, I worked with students. I had students who were cancer patients that were elementary school. And you go working with a student like that, it will change your perspective and how you feel. You might have felt a certain way about students and having to come to class and stuff. And then all of a sudden you realize, well, this is actually why the student hasn't come to class for the last month. And then you might change the way that you look at your methodology and your assessments. And you suddenly won't be so rigid with thinking that this is the only way to do things.
Well, and last question, what would you say to other scholars who might be interested in studying this subject?
Well, one thing I talk about even with my faculty here and faculty in other universities as well, part of what enriches the educational experience is the different methodologies that students are exposed to. So there's a value in everything. I mean, I view that everything that every professor does has value. Now, there's more effective ways of doing it, but there's something that each professor does uniquely that still values the overall educational. That's part of differentiation. They're using a different methodology themselves. But I always try to instill in people that if you're not getting what you want, if you feel like I'm not getting 100% of what I want, then surely there's things I can do to make this situation better. And that's where this that's where this methodology might come in, where you start to look at it and realize, what, there's some value here that might help or add to what I'm currently doing or enhance what I'm currently doing. Especially, it doesn't take very long to get feedback, to look out to a classroom of students, and within the first few minutes, you see a bunch of deer in headlights and realize, how many days in a row can I do this before I change what I'm doing here? And this might help you, change about what you're doing, because there's no better way to engage a classroom than cueing students based on their cultural profile, where they immediately relate to you and they know that the things that they're interested in as well. And that's more of a sustainable way of learning. That's intrinsically motivated for a student. They want to learn versus rewards and punishments and extrinsic types of things that are only small, short-term types of motivators.
Well, that is great. Our author today is Dr. Mike Mucedola of Longwood University. His book, Culture-Based Differentiated Instruction. Dr. Mucedola, thank you for your time today.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And we'll see all of you next time on Fireside Chats with Longwood University faculty. Thank you.